By the time Flynn Turner stepped into that alley, everyone else had already decided the old man was not worth saving. It was late. The kind of late when the city stopped pretending to be busy and started showing its bones. The stores along Mercer Avenue had pulled down their metal shutters. The bus stop lights flickered over cracked pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose and faded, not close enough to help anyone, just close enough to remind people that trouble was always moving through the dark. Flynn was walking home from his second job, with a paper bag of marked-down groceries tucked under one arm and $14 in tips folded inside his sock. He had been on his feet since 5 that morning. His back ached, his shirt smelled like fry oil and motor grease, and every step felt like it belonged to someone twice his age. But he kept walking because he had no money for a cab, no reliable car, and no room in his life for complaints. Then he heard the sound. Not a shout at first, not a cry for help, just a dull, ugly thud, followed by laughter. Flynn stopped beside the mouth of the alley, between a pawn shop and a closed laundromat. He knew that alley. Everybody who worked late on Mercer Avenue knew that alley. People used it as a shortcut during the day and avoided it after sunset. It swallowed light. It collected broken glass, old beer cans, and the kind of people who wanted the world to look away. Flynn should have kept walking. That was the honest truth. He was 23 years old, too thin from skipping meals, with one half-healed bruise on his ribs from unloading boxes at the warehouse, and a mother at home who needed him alive. He had no weapon. He had no backup. He had no reason to believe he could win a fight against anyone, let alone 4 men. But when he looked into the alley, he saw an old biker on the ground. The man had a gray beard, a weathered leather vest, and one trembling hand braced against the asphalt, as if he was trying not to fall all the way down. His motorcycle was tipped over beside him, chrome glinting under the weak light from the street. 4 young men stood around him, laughing, like they had found entertainment instead of a human being. One of them wore a red bandana tucked under his cap. Another kept kicking the old man's boot just to watch him flinch. Their leader stood closest, broad-shouldered and smiling, with the lazy cruelty of someone who had never been stopped before. Flynn did not know the leader's name yet. He did not know that Darnell Price ran with the Southside Kings, a street crew that fed on fear and collected obedience from weaker people the way other men collected money. He did not know that the old biker was Earl Graves. He did not know that Earl was not just an old man, not just a rider, not just another forgotten figure passing through a rough part of town. All Flynn knew was that somebody's grandfather was bleeding in the dark, and 4 men were treating him like he was already gone. For a few seconds, Flynn stood frozen. His body understood danger before his mind could organize it. His heart started hitting his ribs. His hands went cold. He could hear his mother's voice in his memory, telling him not to be a hero, because heroes were what poor families buried when they could not afford proper funerals. But then the old man tried to rise, and one of the Southside Kings shoved him back down. That was the moment Flynn moved. He did not move because he was brave in the way people imagine bravery. He moved because something inside him refused to let the world be that small. He stepped into the alley, his grocery bag falling against his side, and he told the men to leave the old biker alone. His voice shook when he said it, but he said it anyway. The laughter stopped slowly. Darnell Price turned toward him with the expression of a man who had just noticed a bug crawling across his shoe. He looked Flynn up and down, taking in the faded work pants, the cheap shoes, the tired eyes, the paper bag of discount groceries. He saw weakness, because that was all he knew how to recognize. Flynn stood there anyway. Darnell asked him in that low, amused way cruel men use when they want witnesses to enjoy the humiliation whether Flynn had a death wish. Flynn did not answer like a fighter. He did not square his shoulders like a movie hero. He did not threaten anyone. He simply repeated that the old man had taken enough, and that if they wanted someone else to hit, they could hit him. It was not a smart thing to say. But kindness does not always wait for permission from wisdom. One of the men rushed him first. Flynn barely saw the movement before pain flashed across his cheek. The grocery bag tore open when he stumbled, apples rolling into the gutter, a loaf of bread landing in dirty water. Another blow caught him near the stomach and folded him forward. He heard someone laugh. He heard the old biker trying to say something from the ground. He heard his own breath come out broken and thin. Still, Flynn did not run. He backed himself between the old man and the four attackers, not because he believed his body could shield anyone for long, but because it was the only shield he had. He took another hit, then another. His legs nearly gave out, his mind filled with white noise. But every time Darnell expected him to drop and crawl away, Flynn stayed on his feet a little longer. And that, more than any punch Flynn could have thrown, angered Darnell. Men like Darnell depended on the world making sense in one particular way. The strong took, the weak obeyed. People without money lowered their eyes. People without power stayed quiet. But here was a broke kid in a stained uniform, bleeding from the mouth, refusing to understand his place. Darnell stepped closer and made sure Flynn could see his face. He wanted Flynn to remember it. He wanted the old man to remember it. He wanted the alley itself to remember that nobody embarrassed the Southside Kings and walked away clean. The beating might have gone further if headlights had not swept across the alley entrance. A delivery van slowed at the curb. Not stopped, not exactly, but slowed enough. The driver saw figures in the alley, saw a young man bleeding, saw an old man on the ground, and hit the horn. That sharp blast cracked through the night. A second later, someone from an apartment above the laundromat opened a window and shouted down. Darnell made a decision. He did not run because he was afraid. He stepped back because predators are careful with witnesses. He warned Flynn that this was not finished. Then the four men moved out through the back of the alley, disappearing into the dark with the confidence of people who believed consequences were for other men. Flynn waited until they were gone before he let himself fall. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard, tasting blood. The old biker beside him was worse off than he had looked from the street. His face was swollen near one eye. His knuckles scraped his leather vest, torn at the shoulder, but his gaze was steady. He studied Flynn, as if trying to understand what kind of fool would step between four attackers and a stranger. Flynn tried to ask whether he was okay, but the words came out rough. The old man nodded once, slowly, then reached for the fallen motorcycle, as if his first instinct was to check on the machine before himself. Flynn helped him sit up. It took both of them a long moment. Flynn's hands were shaking. Earl's breathing was heavy. Neither of them had the dignity to pretend they were fine. The delivery driver called an ambulance from the curb, and the apartment window stayed open above them. A small audience gathered, at a safe distance, the way people often gather after danger has already happened. Flynn did not blame them. He knew fear. He lived with fear every day. Fear of the landlord, fear of hospital bills, fear of losing a job, fear of coming home one evening and finding his mother on the kitchen floor because the pain in her spine had finally won. When the ambulance arrived, Earl refused the stretcher until Flynn agreed to be checked too. Flynn tried to wave it off. He said he had work in the morning and he could not afford a hospital visit. Earl looked at him then with a strange intensity, the kind that made Flynn stop talking. There was something in the old biker's eyes that did not belong to a helpless man. It was quiet, controlled, and deep as a locked room. Flynn still did not understand. He only knew that the old man insisted on getting his name. Flynn gave it because he was too tired not to. Flynn Turner. Earl Graves repeated it once, as if placing it somewhere important. Then the night moved on. By morning, Flynn's face had swollen purple along the cheekbone. His lip had split open again twice, and his left side hurt every time he breathed too deeply. He did not tell his mother the truth. He told her he had slipped behind the restaurant while taking out trash. It was a bad lie. But his mother, Mara Turner, had spent too many years being poor to waste energy exposing every lie built to protect her. She was sitting in the recliner by the window when Flynn came in, wrapped in the old blue blanket she used whenever her back pain flared. Once, Mara had worked as a nursing assistant. She had been the woman lifting other people's parents from beds, turning them gently, washing them with respect, calling them sweetheart, even when they could no longer remember their own names. She had been strong in the way working women become strong, without applause and without rest. Then a patient had fallen during a night shift, and Mara had caught him before he hit the floor. She saved him from a broken hip and damaged her own spine in the process. At first, she told Flynn it was just a strain. Then came the appointments, the scans, the missed shifts, the unpaid leave, the insurance arguments, the bills that arrived with clean white paper and merciless numbers. By the time Flynn turned 23, his mother could barely cross the room without gripping the wall. There was a surgery that might help. Not a miracle, but a chance. A real chance. A surgeon in another city had reviewed her case and believed the damage could be repaired enough for Mara to walk without constant pain. But the deposit alone was more money than Flynn had ever seen in one place. So Flynn worked. He worked mornings unloading trucks at a warehouse outside the industrial park. He worked afternoons at a small auto parts counter when they needed him. He worked nights washing dishes and sweeping floors at a diner that paid under the table when business was slow. He fixed neighbors' appliances for cash when he could. He sold his father's old fishing gear, his own guitar, and the ring he had once bought for a girl who left when his life became too heavy to carry beside him. He did not resent her for leaving. Not anymore. Some people are built for storms, and some people are built for sunlight. Flynn had learned not to hate either one. Every dollar went into a coffee tin hidden behind a loose panel under the sink. Mara knew about the tin, though Flynn pretended she did not. Sometimes, when he came home late, he found a few folded bills inside that he had not put there. She would claim it was grocery money left over, but Flynn knew she had skipped medication refills or eaten less than she should have. Their love was full of small dishonesties like that. Each one meant to spare the other pain. That morning, when Mara saw his bruised face, her eyes filled with fear before anger. Flynn kissed her forehead, told her not to worry, and moved toward the kitchen because he could not bear the way she looked at him, as if his pain had been added to hers and she had no room left to hold it. He made oatmeal. He counted pills. He checked the calendar where the surgery consultation date was circled in red. Then he changed shirts and went to work. That was Flynn's life. Pain, bills, buses, shifts, and the stubborn hope that if he just kept moving, one day the math might turn gentle. He did not expect to see Earl Graves again. 2 days after the alley, Flynn was outside the diner trying to start his car, if the broken-down thing deserved to be called a car. It was a faded 1998 sedan with mismatched panels, a cracked rear light, and an engine that coughed like it had secrets. Flynn had bought it from a man who promised it only needed a battery. That man had lied, with confidence. The sedan turned over, once groaned, and died. Flynn leaned his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes. He was already late for the warehouse. The bus route would take too long. Missing the shift would cost him money he had already mentally placed inside the coffee tin. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. Then he heard the low sound of a motorcycle pulling into the lot. Not loud in the reckless way some bikes are loud, but deep and steady, like thunder, deciding to behave itself. Flynn looked up and saw Earl Graves riding toward him. The old biker looked different in daylight, still bruised, still moving carefully, but not weak. His gray hair was pulled back. His leather vest had been repaired enough to sit straight on his shoulders. The patches on it meant nothing to Flynn, then just colors and stitching. But Earl wore them with the quiet authority of a man carrying history on his back. He parked beside the sedan, removed his gloves, and greeted Flynn by name. Flynn was surprised he remembered. Earl seemed almost offended by the idea that he would forget the name of someone who had bled for him. Without making a speech, Earl asked Flynn to pop the hood. Flynn tried to protest. Earl ignored the protest with the patience of someone used to younger men saying foolish things. He bent over the engine, listened, while Flynn turned the key, checked the battery connections, examined the starter relay, and found the problem faster than Flynn could explain how long the car had been acting up. Earl had tools in his saddlebag. Of course he did. He worked with calm hands, not hurried, not showy. He cleaned corrosion, tightened a loose ground, adjusted something Flynn had never learned the name of, and after 15 minutes, the old sedan coughed itself awake. Flynn stared at the dashboard like it had performed a miracle. Earl wiped his hands on a rag and told Flynn it would hold for now, but the car needed real work. Flynn said he could not afford real work. Earl looked at him again with those steady eyes and said that some debts did not get paid in dollars. Flynn felt embarrassed by that. He did not like owing people. Poverty teaches a person to distrust generosity, not because generosity is bad, but because too often it comes with hooks hidden inside it. Flynn had learned young that free help could become a leash, but Earl did not push. He simply handed Flynn a small card with an address printed in faded black letters. Graves Custom Motor Works. There was no logo, no fancy slogan, no bright color, just the name, an address on the edge of town, and a phone number. Earl said there was work at the shop if Flynn wanted it. Honest work. Better pay than washing dishes. Flexible hours if he needed to look after his mother. Flynn opened his mouth to ask how Earl knew about his mother, but then remembered the ambulance ride, the tired things he had said, while half dazed and bleeding. He had told Earl more than he meant to. Pride rose in him quickly. It always did. Pride was one of the few possessions poverty could not repossess, unless a person handed it over. Flynn said he did not need charity. Earl did not argue. He said he was not offering charity. He was offering work to someone who had already proved he could show up when it mattered. That sentence stayed with Flynn all day. It followed him through the warehouse shift, through the diner shift, through the bus ride home, because the sedan died again 2 blocks after starting. It sat with him while he helped his mother into bed and counted the money in the coffee tin after she fell asleep. The next morning, he went to Graves Custom Motor Works. The shop stood near the old highway, in a low brick building between a tire yard and a closed furniture warehouse. From the outside, it looked rough but cared for. The windows were clean. The roll-up door was painted black. A row of motorcycles stood along the side lot, each one polished, heavy, and beautiful, in a way Flynn did not expect to appreciate. Inside, the air smelled like oil, metal, rubber, and coffee. Tools hung in perfect order on the wall. Engines sat open on workbenches like puzzles, waiting for patient hands. A radio played low in the corner. 2 men in leather vests looked up when Flynn entered, then went back to work after Earl gave them a small nod. It was not friendliness exactly. It was permission. Earl showed Flynn where to put his jacket and started him on simple tasks: sweeping, sorting parts, cleaning tools, writing inventory numbers, running errands. Nothing glamorous. But Flynn noticed immediately that nobody at the shop treated him like trash. Nobody laughed at his shoes. Nobody called him stupid when he asked questions. If he made a mistake, Earl corrected him once clearly and expected him to learn. That expectation felt like respect. At first, Flynn told himself he was only there for money. The pay was better than the diner, and Earl let him work around his other shifts. But as the days passed, something else happened. Flynn began to listen. He listened to the rhythm of the shop the way the older men could identify an engine problem by sound alone. He listened to stories about cross-country rides, broken roads, bad weather, and brothers lost too early. He listened to Earl explain why talk mattered, why patience mattered more, and why a machine told the truth if a man knew how to hear it. Flynn had never known his father well. His father, Ray Turner, had been a charming man when sober and a storm when drunk. He drifted in and out until Flynn was 12, then drifted out for good. Flynn remembered the smell of cigarettes on his jacket, the scratch of his beard, the promises he made too easily. He remembered his mother sitting at the kitchen table, long after midnight, pretending she was not waiting for headlights that never came. After Ray left, Flynn became careful with men who wanted to teach him things. Too often, teaching was just control wearing a better shirt. But Earl was different. Earl did not pry. He did not demand loyalty. He did not make Flynn feel small for not knowing things. He showed him how to hold a wrench properly, how to check brake lines, how to clean a carburetor, how to read wear patterns on tires. If Flynn got frustrated, Earl made him slow down. If Flynn tried to rush because he was afraid of looking useless, Earl reminded him that speed without care was just another kind of damage. And slowly, Flynn began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way the world would notice. But he started standing straighter at work. He started bringing home stories that made Mara smile. He started sleeping a little better on the nights when his body allowed it. The coffee tin filled faster. The surgery date began to feel less like a fantasy and more like a door somewhere ahead. Mara noticed Earl's influence before Flynn admitted it. She saw the way her son said the old man's name with a softness he tried to hide. She saw the grease under his nails and the pride in his tired face when he described fixing something with his own hands. She saw most of all the relief of him having someone older to call when the world grew too heavy. For the first time in years, Flynn had more than survival. He had a place to go. And that was exactly why Darnell Price decided to take it from him. The Southside Kings did not forget humiliation. In their world, reputation was currency, and Flynn had made Darnell look weak in front of his own men. It did not matter that Flynn had barely survived the alley. It did not matter that Earl was old, injured, and outnumbered. To Darnell, the story had only one meaning. A poor nobody had stepped in. Witnesses had seen it, and Darnell had walked away without finishing what he started. That could not stand. The first warning came outside the warehouse. Flynn finished unloading a truck just after dawn and found a red bandana tied around the driver's side mirror of his sedan. It moved slightly in the morning wind, bright against the faded paint. For a moment, Flynn simply stared at it. No one else seemed to notice. Workers passed behind him, laughing, smoking, complaining about supervisors and overtime. The world continued as if a threat had not just been placed gently on his car. Flynn pulled the bandana loose and threw it in a dumpster. He told himself it was nothing. But all day he felt watched. The second warning came at the auto parts store. Flynn was helping an elderly customer find the correct wiper blades when the phone rang behind the counter. His manager answered, listened, and looked toward Flynn with a strange expression. After hanging up, the manager told Flynn to clock out early. There had been a complaint. Someone had claimed Flynn was stealing small parts and selling them out back. It was absurd. Flynn had never stolen so much as a washer from that place. But poor people learn quickly that innocence is not always a shield. Sometimes it is just a statement nobody has time to verify. Flynn asked to see proof. The manager would not meet his eyes. He said corporate did not want trouble. He said maybe it was best if Flynn took a few days off while things cooled down. A few days off meant a few days unpaid. By the end of the week, the few days became permanent. Flynn lost the job. He came home with the news folded inside him like a blade. Mara saw it before he spoke. Flynn tried to present it calmly, like a scheduling issue, like something temporary. But his mother knew the difference between bad luck and a blow aimed directly at the ribs. She asked whether it had anything to do with the men from the alley. Flynn denied it too quickly. That night, after Mara fell asleep, Flynn sat on the bathroom floor with a coffee tin between his knees and counted the money again. He counted it once, twice, 3 times, as if arithmetic might become kinder through repetition. The missing wages opened a hole in the future. Not a big hole to someone with savings, but to Flynn, it was a canyon. A few $100s could mean postponing the consultation. A postponed consultation could mean another month of Mara's pain. Another month could become another year. The next morning, Earl noticed immediately. Flynn was late to the shop, distracted, quiet, moving like every thought had sharp edges. Earl did not press him in front of the others. He waited until they were alone near the open engine of a Harley and asked what had happened. Flynn tried to deflect. Earl waited. Silence, when used by a patient man, can do what questions cannot. Eventually, Flynn told him about the bandana and the lost job. Earl's face did not change much, but the room seemed to tighten around him. He asked whether Darnell had said anything directly. Flynn said no. Earl asked whether the manager had written anything down. Flynn said no again. Earl absorbed that and told Flynn to keep records from that moment on. Dates, times, names, photos, anything that happened. Flynn almost laughed. Records felt like a luxury. He was not building a court case. He was trying to get through the week. But Earl's voice had weight when he said that men like Darnell survived by making people feel alone. A record was one way of refusing to disappear. So Flynn started keeping notes in an old spiral notebook. At first it felt foolish. Then the pages began to fill. A black SUV idling across the street from his house for 20 minutes. A stranger at the diner asking whether Flynn still enjoyed playing hero. A message scratched into the dust on his car window. 2 missed calls from a blocked number, followed by breathing on the line. A shift supervisor at the warehouse, suddenly deciding Flynn was unreliable after receiving an anonymous tip that he had been using drugs during breaks. That accusation nearly broke him. Flynn had watched addiction take pieces of his father until only the worst parts remained. He did not drink. He did not touch drugs. He barely took pain medicine, unless Mara forced him after the alley beating. But the accusation landed with the cruel precision of a man who knew exactly where to strike. The warehouse required a drug test. Flynn passed it, but the supervisor still cut his hours, claiming the schedule had changed. The Southside Kings did not need to break Flynn's bones. They were breaking his life. The city did not notice. Cities rarely notice suffering when it happens in small administrative forms. A job lost here, hours reduced there, a tire slashed, a landlord made nervous by visitors, a mother frightened but trying not to show it. No single wound looked fatal from the outside, but together they formed a net. And Flynn was caught in it. Earl tried to help, but Flynn resisted more than he accepted. He took extra hours at the shop, yes. He let Earl repair the sedan properly after it failed, again, yes. But whenever Earl offered money, Flynn refused. Whenever Earl suggested that certain problems could be handled, Flynn pulled away. He did not want to bring trouble to the shop. He did not want Earl hurt again. And beneath that, deeper than pride, was fear. Flynn had spent his whole life believing that needing too much from people was dangerous. His father had needed forgiveness until forgiveness became exhaustion. Hospitals needed money, employers needed obedience, landlords needed rent. Everyone needed something. Flynn had built himself around the promise that he would be the one who gave, not the one who asked. But trouble has a way of finding the locked doors inside a person. Darnell found one of Flynn's doors on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Flynn came out of Graves Custom Motor Works and stopped dead in the lot. His sedan had been painted across the side with thick black letters. The words accused him of being a coward, a snitch, and worse. The windshield was cracked. The driver's seat had been cut open through the window they had smashed. Grease had been poured over the hood and into the vents, making the car smell like rot and chemicals. For a few seconds, Flynn felt nothing. Then he felt everything at once. That car was ugly. It was unreliable. It had embarrassed him more times than he could count. But it was also his way to work his way to medical appointments, his way to bring groceries home when Mara could not carry them. It was the first thing he had ever bought entirely with his own money. It was freedom, however dented. Now it sat ruined in the rain, while the men at the shop came out behind him, one by one. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Earl walked around the car slowly. His face looked carved from stone. He noticed the broken glass, the paint, the damage to the ignition. The way the vandalism had been done, not just to destroy, but to humiliate. Then he looked at Flynn. Flynn expected pity, and he hated that expectation before it arrived. Instead, Earl asked if Flynn had photographed everything. Flynn almost snapped. He almost said that pictures would not replace the windshield, would not recover, his hours would not pay for Mara's surgery, would not make Darnell Price stop smiling in the dark. But he saw something in Earl's expression that held him back. Earl was not calm because he did not care. He was calm because anger in him had learned discipline. So Flynn took the photographs. That evening, Earl drove him home. The ride was quiet. Rain moved in silver streaks across the windshield. Flynn watched the city pass, every storefront and streetlight blurred into something tired. He wanted to apologize for the trouble. He wanted to say he should never have stepped into that alley. He wanted to say all the things exhausted people say when the world punishes them for doing right. But Earl spoke first. He told Flynn that the night in the alley had revealed character. Not just Flynn's character, Darnell's too. A man who hurt the weak in darkness did not become strong because people feared him. He simply became practiced at being small. Flynn asked what good character was supposed to do when bills were due. Earl did not answer immediately. Then he said that character did not always save a man from pain, but it decided what kind of man walked out of that pain when the smoke cleared. Flynn wanted those words to comfort him. They did not. Not then, because when they reached his house, the porch light was on. And Mara was not alone. Darnell Price stood near the front steps with two of his men. Mara sat just inside the open doorway, one hand gripping her walker, her face pale, with a kind of fear Flynn had not seen since childhood. The sight of it emptied Flynn's mind. He was out of Earl's truck before it fully stopped moving. Darnell turned with that slow, satisfied smile. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. That was why he had done it. He wanted Flynn to understand that there was no boundary he could hide behind. Not home, not family, not illness, not the fragile dignity of a woman who had already given more to the world than the world had returned. Flynn moved toward him, but Earl caught his arm. It was not a hard grip, but it stopped him. Darnell enjoyed that too. He spoke in a calm, poisonous way, letting Flynn know that accidents happened in neighborhoods like this. Houses caught fire, medicine went missing, old ladies fell when no one was around. He did not need to raise his voice. The softness made it worse. Flynn's body shook with rage. He wanted for one wild second to destroy Darnell with his bare hands. He wanted to make him feel even a fraction of what Mara had felt, sitting trapped in her own doorway while strangers used her pain as leverage. But Flynn was not a fighter, and even if he had been, there were three of them. His anger could not change that math. Earl stepped forward. Something shifted then. Darnell's smile thinned. It was quick, almost invisible, but Flynn saw it. For the first time since the alley, Darnell looked at Earl not like an old victim, but like a question he did not yet know how to answer. Earl did not threaten him. He did not posture. He simply told Darnell to leave the woman's porch. Darnell looked at the leather vest. His eyes moved over the patches. He lingered on one in particular, the curved top rocker with the words "Iron Reapers" stitched in white over black. Flynn noticed the pause, but still did not understand it. Darnell recovered quickly. He laughed, made a show of stepping away, and warned Flynn that the old man could not be everywhere. Then he and his men walked off down the street, their confidence returning with each step. Mara tried to act composed after they left. She failed. The moment Flynn reached her, she broke. Not loudly. Mara was not a loud woman. She folded inward, shaking against him, while he held her as gently as he could. She apologized to him for being afraid. That hurt more than the smashed car, more than the lost job, more than the bruises from the alley. His mother was apologizing for being terrorized. Something inside Flynn cracked. Earl helped secure the house that night. He checked the windows, replaced the weak back door latch with a temporary brace from his truck, and told Flynn to keep the porch light on. Before leaving, he gave Flynn a number different from the one on the shop card. He said that if Darnell came back, Flynn should call it immediately. Flynn looked at the number, then at Earl. There were questions between them now, heavy and obvious. Who was Earl Graves really? Why had Darnell paused at the patch? Why did the men at the shop obey his smallest nod? Why did Earl move through the world like someone who had already survived every threat younger men could invent? But Flynn did not ask. He was too tired, too ashamed, too scared of learning that the one good thing that had entered his life came with shadows he could not afford. The next days became a test of endurance. Earl arranged for one of the shop workers to drive Flynn to shifts. Flynn protested until Earl told him to stop mistaking help for weakness. Mara's consultation was only 3 weeks away, and Flynn could not afford to miss work. So he accepted the rides with a stiff nod and a burning face. The notebook grew thicker. The police took reports, but reports did not keep men off porches. The officers were not cruel, some even seemed sympathetic, but sympathy moved slowly, and Darnell moved fast. The Southside Kings knew how to stay just outside the reach of easy proof. They used blocked numbers, borrowed cars, rumor, pressure. They turned the machinery of ordinary life against people who had none to spare. Flynn began sleeping in the living room near the front door. He told Mara it was because the couch helped his ribs. She pretended to believe him. At night, he listened for footsteps, engines breaking glass. He kept his work boots beside the couch and Earl's emergency number under his phone. Every day he felt himself becoming smaller. That was the strange cruelty of intimidation. It did not only threaten what a person had, it threatened who they were allowed to be. Flynn, who had stepped into an alley because he could not ignore suffering, now found himself calculating every movement. Should he go to the store before dark? Should he park near a light? Should he let Mara answer the door? Should he tell Earl about every new threat, or would that make him a burden? Fear turned life into a series of cages. Darnell knew it. That was why he arrived at the diner on a Saturday night. Flynn had gone back to washing dishes for extra cash, even after Earl told him he did not need to run himself into the ground. The diner was short-staffed, and the owner paid cash at the end of the night. Flynn needed every dollar. He was in the back, sleeves rolled up, hands in hot water, when the room outside went strangely quiet. He looked through the small service window and saw Darnell sitting in a booth with 2 Southside Kings. The owner, a nervous man named Pete, stood near the register, pretending not to look scared. Customers kept their faces down. The waitress moved like a person handling a loaded weapon. Darnell had not touched anyone. He did not need to. His presence was the violence. Flynn came out from the kitchen with wet hands and a cold feeling in his chest. Darnell smiled at him like they were old friends. Then he placed something on the table. Flynn's coffee tin. For a moment, the world lost sound. It was dented, scratched, unmistakable. The old blue coffee tin Mara had used for coupons, before it became the container for every dollar Flynn could save. The tin that had lived behind the loose panel under the sink. The tin that represented years of exhaustion, skipped meals, pawned, memories, and hope, counted in crumpled bills. Darnell had been inside his house. Flynn felt the room tilt. Darnell did not empty the tin in front of everyone. That would have been too simple. Instead, he slid it back and forth on the table with one finger, enjoying the way Flynn's eyes followed it. He made it clear that he could take anything: money, medicine, sleep, safety, the surgery, Flynn's future, Mara's hope. Then he said, in his own way, that all Flynn had to do was kneel to the truth of the neighborhood. Stop working for Earl. Stop writing things down. Stop acting like a man with protection. Apologize publicly for stepping into business that was not his. Admit that the Southside Kings owned the streets Flynn walked. Flynn did not move. Inside him, everything was burning. He wanted the tin. He wanted to run home to check on Mara. He wanted to throw himself across the booth and beat Darnell until his hands broke. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to be 10 years old again, before he understood that some men enjoying making others beg. But beneath all that, under the fear and rage and humiliation, a small memory rose. Earl's voice in the shop. Men like Darnell survived by making people feel alone. Flynn looked around the diner. Pete looked away. The waitress looked close to tears. The customers stared at plates they no longer wanted. Everyone was afraid. Not because they were bad people, because fear had trained them. Because Darnell had built his throne out of moments exactly like this. Flynn understood then that Darnell did not simply want money or revenge. He wanted worship. He wanted the room to witness Flynn's surrender so the story could spread. He wanted every person there to remember that kindness had consequences and courage was expensive, and nobody came when the Southside Kings decided to collect. Flynn reached into his pocket for his phone. Darnell's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for that too. One of his men stood ready to take it, but Flynn did not call the police. He did not call Pete over. He did not call his mother. He called Earl Graves. His thumb shook so badly he almost missed the number. The line rang once. Then Earl answered. Flynn did not make a speech. He could barely speak at all. He said where he was. He said Darnell had the surgery money. He said his mother might not be safe. And then, because the last of his pride had finally collapsed under the weight of love, Flynn said he needed help. There was a short silence on the other end. Then Earl told him he was on his way. Darnell heard enough to laugh. He leaned back in the booth, amused by the idea that one old biker could change what was about to happen. He told Flynn that Earl should have stayed in his lane. He told the room that they were about to see what happened when old men and poor boys mistook a motorcycle club patch for a crown. Flynn stood near the counter, heart pounding, eyes on the tin. Minutes passed. 3 minutes. 5. 7. The diner remained frozen in dread. Outside traffic moved along Mercer Avenue as if nothing important was happening. Flynn thought of Mara alone at home and nearly broke. He called one of Earl's shop workers, who answered immediately and said someone was already watching the house. Flynn did not understand, but he clung to the words. Someone was watching the house. Darnell grew bored. Boredom made him crueler. He opened the coffee tin. The sound of the lid coming off was small, metallic, devastating. Inside were the bills Flynn had saved, neatly folded, rubber-banded, counted so many times the paper had softened. There were also 2 notes in Mara's handwriting, small slips she had tucked in when adding money she pretended not to have. One said that every little bit counted. The other said that someday they would both rest. Darnell lifted one of the notes, read it, and smiled. That was the moment Flynn almost lost control. He stepped forward, and one of Darnell's men reached into his jacket. The room tightened. Someone gasped. Then the first motorcycle arrived. It was not loud at first, just a distant rumble, low and steady beneath the city noise. Then another joined it, and another, and another. The sound grew rolling down Mercer Avenue like weather changing its mind. Glasses trembled on the diner shelves. The neon sign in the window flickered. Customers lifted their heads. Darnell's smile faded. The rumble became thunder. Motorcycles filled the street outside, not 2 or 3, not a handful of old men playing at toughness, but dozens. Headlights washed across the diner windows in white rows. Engines lined the curb, stretched past the laundromat, past the pawn shop, past the alley where the whole thing had started. Riders dismounted in black leather vests, moving with calm discipline, not rushing, not shouting, not waving weapons, just arriving, with the certainty of a force that did not need to announce itself twice. At the center of them was Earl Graves. He stepped through the diner door alone. The bell above the entrance gave a small, ridiculous chime. Nobody moved. Earl was not tall in a dramatic way. He was not young. His face still carried faint bruises from the alley, but the room changed around him. Men like Darnell made rooms smaller. Earl made them honest. Behind him through the windows, the Iron Reapers stood in the street. Flynn finally understood the patch. He understood it in pieces, the way a person understands lightning after the thunder has already shaken the windows. The careful nods at the shop, the respect, the pause in Darnell's face on Mara's porch, the emergency number, the sense that Earl carried a history larger than his own body. Earl Graves was not just a member of the Iron Reapers. He was their president, and judging by the faces outside, he was loved in the dangerous, loyal way men love someone who has carried them through fire. Darnell tried to recover. He stood, slowly forcing a smile back onto his face, but it looked wrong now, too thin, too late. He said something meant to sound dismissive, something about Earl bringing a parade to a diner. Earl did not respond to the performance. He looked at the coffee tin on the table, then at Flynn's split lip, then at Darnell. The silence that followed was worse for Darnell than shouting. Earl asked for the tin. Darnell did not hand it over. Not immediately. His pride could not allow him to obey in front of the room. But pride is a fragile thing when stripped of its audience's fear. Darnell looked around and saw that the waitress was no longer looking down. Pete was no longer pretending to wipe the counter. Customers were watching, now really watching. Outside Iron Reapers stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the streetlights, and not one of them seemed eager for violence. That made them more frightening, not less. They had not come to brawl. They had come to end something. Earl stepped closer and told Darnell that taking money for a sick woman's surgery had been a choice. Threatening her in her own doorway had been a choice. Vandalizing Flynn's car, destroying his jobs, stalking his home, and terrorizing working people had all been choices. Men were allowed to make choices. They were not allowed to escape what those choices revealed. Darnell tried to laugh again. No one joined him. Then Earl placed a folder on the table. Flynn had never seen it before. Darnell had not either. Inside were photographs, dates, witness statements, security stills, call logs, and printed reports. The notebook Flynn had kept had become something larger. The smashed car, the porch visit, the diner intimidation, the anonymous calls, the false accusations, the red bandana, the footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, the service station camera that caught one of Darnell's men near Flynn's car, the pawn shop camera that caught the Southside Kings entering the alley the night Earl was attacked. Earl had not been waiting because he was passive. He had been building the wall Darnell would eventually run into. The Iron Reapers had not simply watched. They had gathered. They had documented. They had spoken to business owners who had been too frightened to act alone. They had found the delivery driver from the alley. They had convinced the apartment tenant above the laundromat to give a statement. They had helped Pete install cameras after Darnell's first visit to the diner. They had placed men near Mara's house without making a show of it. They had done what strong people are supposed to do when weaker people are being hunted. They had made fear change sides. Darnell saw it. The first real crack in him appeared when 2 police cruisers turned onto Mercer Avenue. Then another. Then an unmarked car. This was not the random arrival of officers responding to a noise complaint. They came with purpose. They parked behind the line of motorcycles, and several officers stepped out with expressions that said they already knew why they were there. Darnell's men shifted uneasily. One moved toward the back door, only to stop when he saw Iron Reapers visible through the rear window too, standing in the alley, without touching anyone, blocking nothing illegally, simply occupying space with patient eyes. Darnell had built his power on making others feel surrounded. Now he understood the feeling. The officers entered. Earl did not make a speech to them. He had already made his case before they arrived. He simply stepped aside. Pete, the diner owner, finally found his voice and confirmed that Darnell had been threatening Flynn. The waitress confirmed it too. A customer raised his hand and said he had recorded part of the exchange on his phone. Flynn watched it happen in disbelief, as if the room had been holding its breath for years and had only just remembered how to exhale. Darnell tried to threaten them with his eyes. It no longer worked. That was the beginning of his undoing. The police did not drag him out in some grand, violent spectacle. Real justice often looks quieter than people expect. It looks like wrists turned behind a back. It looks like a man who spent years demanding fear, suddenly being told to stand still. It looks like paperwork, statements, evidence bags, charges read in a level voice. It looks like the audience he once controlled, watching without lowering their eyes. But the poetry of it was clear. Darnell Price had used witnesses as weapons. He had humiliated people in public so fear would spread faster. Now, witnesses were the reason he could not talk his way free. The same rooms he had terrorized became rooms willing to speak. The same neighborhood he had treated as property became the net that held him. As officers led him toward the door, Darnell looked at Flynn. There was hatred there, but beneath it, something smaller and more painful to him. Confusion. He still did not understand how someone like Flynn had become someone worth protecting. That was Darnell's failure, and maybe it had always been. He believed worth came from fear, money, muscle, and control. He did not understand the kind of worth built quietly in kitchens, in hospital rooms, in late shifts, in alleys, where a man with nothing still chooses to stand between cruelty and a stranger. Flynn did not say anything to him. He did not need to. Earl picked up the coffee tin and handed it back. Flynn held it with both hands. The metal was cold. The money was still inside. Mara's notes were still inside. Something about that broke him more than if the tin had been empty. He turned away quickly, but Earl saw the tears anyway. The old biker placed a hand on his shoulder. Not heavy, not possessive, just there. For the first time since he was a child, Flynn let someone older hold part of the weight. The aftermath did not turn life magical overnight. That is not how healing works. Darnell's arrest weakened the Southside Kings, but it also exposed how much damage they had done. Other people began coming forward. A mechanic from the East Side reported extortion. A grocery clerk admitted they had been forced to hand over cash weekly. 2 teenagers gave statements about being recruited through threats. Pete turned over security footage from previous incidents. The story spread first through Mercer Avenue, then through the county, not as gossip, but as release. People who had been afraid alone discovered they had been afraid together. The Iron Reapers became a visible presence for a while, but not in the way Flynn expected. They did not patrol like conquerors. They helped repair broken windows. They escorted elderly residents to evening appointments until the worst of the retaliation fears passed. They fixed locks. They raised money for businesses that had been paying Southside Kings protection money. They worked with a community center to create a safe ride program for late-shift workers. Flynn watched all of it with a strange ache in his chest. He had thought power meant the ability to hurt. Earl showed him another kind. Power could also mean the ability to gather people until fear loosened its grip. It could mean showing up before someone asked. It could mean standing close enough to make cruelty reconsider. It could mean discipline restraint and a refusal to let the vulnerable be picked off one by one. A week after the diner, Earl came to Flynn's house for dinner. Mara insisted on cooking, though Flynn and Earl did most of the work while pretending she was supervising. She sat in her chair with a blanket over her legs and watched Earl move around the small kitchen like he belonged there. He chopped vegetables badly. Flynn corrected him with exaggerated seriousness. Earl accepted the correction with dignity, then continued chopping badly in a slightly different way. For the first time in months, Mara laughed without pain, swallowing it immediately. That sound changed the room. After dinner, Earl placed an envelope on the table. Flynn's whole body tensed. He already knew it was money before Earl explained. The Iron Reapers had a hardship fund built over years, from charity rides, shop profits, member dues, and donations from people they had helped. The club had voted unanimously to cover the deposit for Mara's surgery and the travel expenses around it. Earl made clear that it was not a loan. It was not a favor Flynn would spend his life repaying. It was what the fund was for. Flynn refused. Of course he did. He refused once politely, then again with heat, then a third time with tears threatening to humiliate him. He said they could not accept that much. He said other people needed help too. He said he would work. He would find a way. He was close. He just needed more time. Mara's face crumpled at the words, more time. Earl let Flynn finish. Then he told him the truth, with the tenderness of someone unwilling to flatter him. Flynn had done everything a son could do. He had worked until his body shook. He had sold what he owned. He had swallowed pride 100 times in private while guarding it in public. But love was not supposed to require a person to bleed alone forever. Sometimes accepting help was not surrender. Sometimes it was the next brave thing. Flynn looked at his mother. Mara was crying quietly, not because she wanted the money, but because she wanted her son back from the edge of exhaustion. She wanted him to have mornings that did not begin with panic. She wanted him to be young for even a little while before life hardened around him completely. Flynn broke then, not dramatically. He simply sat down, covered his face, and let the fight leave him. The surgery was scheduled. The weeks leading up to it felt unreal. Earl drove them to appointments when Flynn could not. Members of the Iron Reapers took turns covering shifts at the shop so Flynn could be with Mara. One of them, a retired nurse named June, who rode a dark green Indian Scout and tolerated no foolishness from anyone, explained the medical paperwork better than the hospital did. Another member fixed the ramp outside Mara's house. Pete from the diner organized meals. The waitress who had witnessed Darnell's arrest brought soup and a stack of paperbacks for Mara to read during recovery. Help arrived from every direction. Flynn did not know what to do with it at first. He kept trying to earn each kindness immediately, as if generosity were a bill that might gain interest if unpaid. But slowly, under the steady pressure of people refusing to let him make love into debt, he began to breathe. The day of the surgery, Flynn sat in the hospital waiting room with Earl beside him. Hospitals had always made Flynn feel poor in a specific way. Not just financially poor, but powerless. The clean floors, the coded announcements, the soft shoes of nurses moving quickly, the machines with prices he could not imagine, the forms that translated human fear into account numbers. He had spent years believing that places like this were where hope went to be measured and denied. That morning, he expected terror to consume him. It did not. Fear was there, of course. It sat in his stomach. It tightened his hands. It made every hour stretch too long. But he was not alone inside it. Earl sat beside him with bad coffee. June checked in. Messages came from the shop. Pete sent a photo of the diner staff holding a handmade sign for Mara. Even the warehouse supervisor, after learning the truth about the false accusation, sent an awkward apology through a co-worker and offered Flynn his hours back. Flynn did not know whether he would accept. That surprised him. For so long he had taken whatever life offered because refusal felt like a luxury. Now, for the first time, he considered that dignity might have a say. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. When the surgeon finally came out, Flynn stood so fast his chair hit the wall. The doctor looked tired, but not grim. He explained that the procedure had gone well. There would be pain therapy, a careful recovery, no promises beyond what medicine could honestly give. But the repair had been successful. The pressure on the damaged nerves had been relieved. Mara had a real chance. A real chance. Flynn nodded as if he understood. Then he walked into the hallway and cried so hard he could not breathe. Earl found him there a minute later. He did not tell Flynn to be strong. He did not offer some polished phrase about everything happening for a reason. He simply stood beside him until the storm passed. That was when Flynn realized what Earl had become to him. Not a replacement for the father who left. No one can replace what absence shapes in a child. But Earl had become proof that manhood did not have to mean abandonment, intimidation, or pride sharpened into cruelty. It could mean showing up, teaching patiently, protecting without owning, giving without making the receiver small. Flynn had spent years preparing to become hard. Earl made him want to become steady instead. Mara's recovery was slow, painful, and beautiful. The first time she stood after surgery with less pain than before, she wept. The first time she took 3 steps without gripping Flynn's arm hard enough to bruise him, he laughed in disbelief. The first time she made it from the bedroom to the porch with only a cane, neighbors applauded from across the street, because good news in a neighborhood used to bad news travels quickly. There were hard days too, days when therapy left her exhausted, days when the pain returned and fear followed it, days when Flynn panicked at every setback, terrified the hope would be taken back. But the direction had changed. That mattered. Healing was not a straight line, but it was a road. And Flynn at last began to imagine a future that was not only about surviving until the next bill arrived. Earl had been thinking about that future too. One afternoon at the shop, after Flynn had finished helping rebuild a transmission, Earl called him into the office. The office was small, crowded with old photographs, invoices, club memorabilia, and a framed picture of a much younger Earl standing beside a woman with bright eyes and wind-blown hair. Flynn had seen the photo before, but never asked about it. He knew grief when it guarded a room. On the desk was a folder. Flynn smiled uneasily and said he had learned to be nervous when Earl put folders on tables. Earl almost smiled back. Inside were papers for a vocational program in motorcycle and diesel mechanics at a technical college 2 towns over. There was also information about a scholarship fund. Not a famous one, not something with a rich donor's name in gold letters. It was new, created by the Iron Reapers after everything that had happened. They called it the Turner Graves Trade Scholarship, though Flynn immediately objected to his name being on anything that sounded that official. Earl ignored the objection. The scholarship would support working-class students entering skilled trades, especially those caring for family members. The first award, Earl explained, had already been approved by the club. It covered Flynn's tuition, tools, books, and enough living support that he could reduce his shifts and actually study. Flynn stared at the papers. He had no idea what to feel. For years, school had been something other people did. People with parents who could help. People with savings. People who did not have to choose between a textbook and a prescription. Flynn had once been good with machines in high school. He had loved taking apart small engines, repairing bicycles, understanding how pieces spoke to each other. But after Mara's injury, wanting things felt selfish, so he stopped wanting them. Earl was placing the want back in front of him. Flynn said he could not leave the shop. Earl told him the shop would still be there. Flynn said his mother might need him. Earl said Mara had already threatened to disown everyone involved if Flynn used her as an excuse. Flynn said he was not the kind of person scholarships were made for. At that, Earl's expression hardened just enough to stop him. Earl told him that was exactly the lie men like Darnell wanted people like Flynn to believe. That goodness was supposed to be quiet. That sacrifice was supposed to stay invisible. That poor kids could save others, but not themselves. That dignity meant refusing every open door until exhaustion killed the part of them that dreamed. Flynn looked down at the application until the words blurred. He accepted, not easily, not without fear, but he accepted. Around the same time, the Iron Reapers offered him something else. A prospect patch. Flynn knew enough by then to understand that it mattered. Becoming a prospect did not make him a full member. It did not hand him instant belonging like a prize. It meant service, learning, responsibility. It meant showing up early, staying late, listening more than speaking, earning trust over time. It meant being tested, not for violence, but for character. Earl made that clear. The Iron Reapers were not looking for men who wanted to feel powerful. They had enough history to know how dangerous that hunger could become. They were looking for men who understood loyalty as responsibility. Men who could stand in a hard moment without needing applause. Men who knew the difference between courage and cruelty. Flynn thought about the alley. He thought about the old man on the ground, the 4 attackers, the apple rolling into the gutter, the taste of blood, the moment he had believed he was alone and stepped forward anyway. Back then, he had not known he was choosing a new life. Most important choices do not introduce themselves properly. They arrive disguised as interruptions. Flynn accepted the prospect patch with hands that trembled slightly. The first time he wore it, Mara cried again, though she tried to hide it by complaining that the vest needed cleaning. Earl pretended not to see. The men at the shop gave Flynn a hard time, in the affectionate way men do when emotion gets too close to the surface. June inspected the stitching and declared it acceptable. Pete from the diner sent over a pie with Flynn's name spelled wrong in frosting. which somehow made the whole thing better. But the moment that stayed with Flynn came later that night. He rode with Earl at the back of a small formation, not far, just out beyond the old highway, where the city lights thinned and the fields opened under the evening sky. Flynn was not on some perfect machine. He rode a repaired, used bike Earl had helped him buy on a payment plan so gentle it was basically a conspiracy of kindness. The engine vibrated under him. The road stretched ahead. For once, the sound around him did not feel like danger. It felt like belonging. Earl rode ahead, steady as ever, his vest moving in the wind. Flynn followed, thinking of how strange life was. An alley had become a doorway. A beating had become a bond. A stranger had become family. The worst night he could remember had led somehow to the first future that felt like his own. Months passed. Darnell Price's case moved through the courts with less drama than rumors promised. Some charges stuck, others became part of broader investigations. Several Southside kings took deals and gave information. Their hold on Mercer Avenue broke, not all at once, but enough for people to feel the difference. The black SUV stopped idling near Flynn's house. The diner stayed open later. The laundromat replaced its broken sign. The pawnshop owner, who had watched too much and spoken too little for too long, installed brighter lights over the alley. Flynn walked past that alley sometimes. At first, he avoided it. Then, one afternoon, he stopped at the entrance and looked in. In daylight, it seemed smaller. That surprised him. The place that had felt like the mouth of a monster was just a narrow strip of cracked pavement between buildings. There were stains, old trash, a dented dumpster, a patch of weeds pushing through concrete. Nothing mystical, nothing grand, just an ugly little place where men had done an ugly little thing. But that was how evil often worked. It did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it waited in ordinary corners, counting on everyone to keep walking. Flynn stood there for a long time. He thought about how close he had come to walking away. Not because he was heartless, but because he was tired, because he was scared, because the world had given him every reason to protect only what was his. He wondered how many people had faced moments like that and made choices they later carried in silence. He no longer judged them easily. Fear was real. Survival was real. But he also knew this. A life can turn on the moment a person decides that someone else's pain matters. Not because there is a reward waiting, not because the stranger is important in disguise, not because a powerful motorcycle club will one day pull up with headlights blazing and make the cruel men tremble. Flynn did not save Earl because Earl was powerful. He saved him because Earl was hurt. That was the part Earl never let anyone forget. When people at the shop told the story too dramatically, when they made Flynn sound fearless, or made Earl sound like a hidden king testing the worth of strangers, Earl always corrected them. Flynn had not known anything. That was what made it matter. He had stepped forward without knowing the old man's name, without knowing the patch, without knowing help would ever come back to him. Kindness with no guarantee is the rarest kind. It is also the kind that can change everything. By the time Flynn started technical college, Mara was walking short distances with a cane. She still had pain, but it no longer owned every room before she entered it. She volunteered twice a week at the community center, helping other patients understand medical paperwork and insurance forms. She said that after years of needing help, it felt good to become useful again. Flynn told her she had never stopped being useful. She told him not to argue with his mother. He did well in school, better than he expected. At first, he feared being older than some students, poorer than most, and behind everyone. But machines still made sense to him. Systems made sense. Pressure timing, fuel, spark wear, repair. These were problems with causes. Problems that could be studied, understood, fixed. After years of fighting invisible threats, there was comfort in an engine telling the truth. He worked at the shop between classes. He fulfilled prospect duties. He visited Mara. He slept more. Not enough, maybe, but more than before. The coffee tin remained under the sink, though its purpose changed. Mara refused to throw it away. She cleaned it, hammered out the worst dent, and placed it back behind the panel. Now they used it for something different. Road money. Not emergency money. Not surgery money. Not survival money. Road money. Someday, Mara said, when she was strong enough, Flynn would drive her somewhere with mountains. She wanted to see morning light on a place that did not know their troubles. Flynn promised her they would go. This time, the promise did not feel like a lie told to survive the night. It felt like a plan. A year after the alley, the Iron Reapers held a charity ride for the new scholarship fund. Riders came from 3 counties. Families gathered near the shop. Food trucks lined the lot. Local businesses donated raffle prizes. Pete ran a coffee stand and claimed his diner had always been famous, though everyone knew it survived mostly because his pancakes were cheap and his staff was kind. June organized the registration table with military precision. Mara sat beneath a canopy, wearing sunglasses and accepting compliments like royalty, pretending to be humble. Flynn stood near the row of bikes in his prospect vest, watching people arrive. He saw workers from the warehouse, nurses from the hospital, the delivery driver from the alley, the waitress from the diner, neighbors who had once been too afraid to open their doors and now stood together in broad daylight. He saw Earl speaking with a young man who looked the way Flynn used to look, tired, guarded, ashamed of needing help. Earl listened to him with that same patient stillness. Flynn smiled. The world had not become perfect. It never does. There were still bills, hard days, court dates, bad memories, and people who mistook fear for respect. But something real had been repaired. Not just a car, not just a spine, not just a neighborhood sense of safety. A chain had been repaired. One person had stood for another. Then others had stood for him. Then more people found the courage to stand together. That was how dignity returned, not as a miracle, but as a series of choices passed from hand to hand. Before the ride began, Earl called everyone close. He did not make a long speech. Earl hated long speeches, unless he was the one accusing Flynn of rushing a repair. But he spoke about the purpose of the fund, about skilled work, about families carrying too much alone, and about the responsibility of those with strength to use it carefully. He never once turned the day into a celebration of violence or revenge. That mattered to Flynn. The point had never been that the Iron Reapers were frightening. The point was that their strength had become shelter. Then Earl called Flynn forward. Flynn hated being called forward. Everyone who knew him knew this, which meant everyone enjoyed it. He walked to Earl with his face warm and his hands awkward at his sides. Earl looked at him with an expression that almost undid him. Pride, yes, but also something quieter. Gratitude. Love, though neither of them would have used the word easily in front of a crowd. Earl told the people gathered there that the scholarship existed because one young man had reminded them what courage looked like before it had backup. He said courage was not noise. It was not swagger. It was not the need to dominate a room. Sometimes courage was a tired kid with a bag of groceries stepping into a dark alley because an old man was bleeding. Flynn looked down. He could feel Mara crying from 30 feet away. Then Earl handed him a small patch. Not a full member patch. Not yet. Flynn still had time to serve as a prospect. The club did not bend its traditions for sentiment, and Flynn respected that. This patch was different. It was simple, stitched in black and white, with 2 words. Stand anyway. Flynn ran his thumb over the letters. He knew what they meant. Stand when you are scared. Stand when you are outnumbered. Stand when nobody is filming. Stand when the person on the ground cannot repay you. Stand when your knees shake. Stand when the world has taught you to keep walking. Stand anyway. Not foolishly, not violently, not for pride, for love, for dignity. For the stubborn belief that cruelty should never get the final word, simply because it arrived with more men. The ride began just after noon. Engines started one by one until the lot filled with sound. Mara covered her ears and laughed. Flynn mounted his bike. Earl rode ahead of him. The Iron Reapers moved out in formation, joined by dozens of riders who had come not to intimidate anyone, but to carry a story down the highway. People waved from sidewalks as they passed through Mercer Avenue. When they rode by the alley, Flynn glanced toward it once. Only one. The place looked even smaller now. Then the road opened, and he followed Earl into the light. There is a lesson people often take from stories like Flynn's, but it is usually the easy one. They say, you never know who you are helping. They say, the stranger you save might turn out to be powerful. They say kindness might come back bigger than you ever imagined. And maybe that is true. But it is not the deepest truth. The deeper truth is that kindness matters, even when nobody powerful is watching. It matters when the person on the ground has no title, no club, no money, no secret army of loyal friends waiting beyond the edge of the dark. It matters because every act of mercy argues against the lie that the cruel own the world. Flynn Turner did not become brave because the Iron Reapers arrived. The Iron Reapers arrived because Flynn had already been brave. That is the part worth remembering. Long before the thunder of motorcycles shook Mercer Avenue, long before Darnell Price learned that fear could turn around and face him, long before Mara walked again with sunlight on her face, there was only a tired young man at the mouth of an alley, holding a torn bag of groceries, listening to an old man being hurt in the dark. He had every reason to keep walking. He stepped forward anyway. And sometimes, that is where a new life begins. If this story moved you, remember Flynn the next time the world gives you a reason to look away. You may not be able to fix everything. You may not be able to defeat every cruel person or heal every wound. But there will be moments when someone near you needs proof that they have not been abandoned to the dark. In those moments, courage may not feel like courage. It may feel like fear. It may feel like trembling hands. It may feel like a voice that shakes when you use it. Use it anyway. Because one decent act, offered with no promise of reward, can become the first link in a chain strong enough to pull whole lives back into the light.